the story of a man who was already dead to his family. 2 days before the flight that would make him immortal, Yuri Gagarin sat down to write a farewell letter. His chances of returning were less than 50%. He wrote to his wife, urging her not to be consumed by grief and to find another partner. He asked her to raise their daughters to be upstanding individuals. This letter would only be delivered to her 7 years later, after his actual demise. Today, we will reveal what lay behind this sacrifice and why his flight was even more dangerous than you might imagine. An explosion at launch, life support system failure in orbit, a slow death by asphyxiation, brake system malfunction, left in space forever, the capsule burning up during atmospheric re-entry. This wasn't a movie, these were real statistics of failures. Out of 25 unmanned precursor launches to Vostok 1, 12 ended in catastrophe, almost 50%. Essentially, it was a game of cosmic Russian roulette with 2 bullets in a 4-chamber cylinder. Yet, there was Gagarin before the launch, absolutely calm, even cracking jokes. How was this possible, sitting on a rocket that had a 1 in 2 chance of becoming his coffin? This is called psychological armor, a state where the mission outweighs the instinct for self-preservation. It's not an absence of fear, but rather it's tunneling. A brain trained by hundreds of hours in a centrifuge enters autopilot mode. The amygdala, our fear center, is simply suppressed by the prefrontal cortex, the decision-making center. But the letter, that was just the tip of the iceberg. In this film, we will show why Gagarin was actually chosen, even though he wasn't the best candidate. What 3 catastrophic failures occurred during the 108 minutes of flight that no one knew about. And what secret about his landing did the Soviet government conceal for 30 years to maintain its global leadership in space? Now, stop for a second. Imagine you have to write such a letter. You have only 3 sentences to say goodbye to the person closest to you. What would you write? This is not a rhetorical question. It is precisely this choice that transforms an ordinary person into a hero. To understand his decision, we need to go back a year, to the cosmonaut corps, to where a fierce battle was being waged for the right to be the first, and Gagarin was losing this battle. This wasn't just a group of pilots, it was an elite of 20 men, from which the 6 best were selected. The first 6, unofficially called the Diamond Six. Gherman Titov, a poet and intellectual, physically the most resilient. Grigory Nelyubov, audacious, the best in piloting technique. Alongside them were Andriy Nikolaev, Pavel Popovich, Valery Bykovsky. Each was honed to the peak of human capability. The competition was ruthless. Every day was a test of survival. By all objective measures, Gagarin was not number 1. The top candidate was considered to be Gherman Titov. Medical tests, psychological stability, reaction to G-forces. Titov was superior. For instance, he could endure rotation in the vestibular chair, which simulated space disorientation longer than anyone else, all while maintaining absolute clarity of mind. He was being prepared for more complex missions. So why was the second best chosen? The answer? Ideology. Gagarin was not just a pilot, he was the ideal avatar of the Soviet man. A simple guy from the countryside with a disarming smile. If the USSR were a brand, Gagarin would have been its face. His smile was more powerful than any nuclear warhead in the arsenal of propaganda. Titov, with his complex intellectual demeanor, looked like a scientist, not a son of the people. This was not only an engineering choice, but a marketing one. In the balance of choosing the first cosmonaut, technical readiness accounted for 40%, the other 60%, political expediency. History isn't always about the best, often it's about the most suitable. And in the Cold War, the right face was as much a weapon as a rocket. General Nikolai Kamanin, responsible for training, wrote directly in his diaries, all else being equal, Gagarin's biography and smile were the decisive factors. But there was another side to the coin. A little-known fact, an anonymous vote was held within the Corps. The question was simple. Whom would you send on the flight? Out of 20 cosmonauts, 17 named Gagarin. This was almost unanimous recognition. His leadership wasn't just decreed from above. It was real, earned among his peers. He knew how to be not just the best, but one of them. The State Commission made its final decision just 3 days before launch. Until the last moment, Gherman Titov was prepared as a full backup. He was given an identical spacesuit, and the same spacecraft was configured for him. He was ready to replace Gagarin at any second. But the greatest drama was yet to come, at an altitude of 300 kilometers, where the human factor no longer mattered. April 12, 1961. Baikonur. The roar of 32 engines shattered the silence of the steppe, the famous Poyakali. Let's go. But behind that calm voice lay something Soviet propaganda would remove from all reports. Sensors on Gagarin's body showed a pulse of 157 beats per minute. For comparison, this is the pulse of a sprinter at the finish line of a 100-meter dash. Only Gagarin was lying motionless. His body ran that sprint, strapped to a chair. And his body was right, almost immediately. The first malfunction. One of the blocks of the rocket's third stage failed to shut down on time, just a few extra seconds of engine operation, and the craft was thrown into an unplanned, excessively high orbit. Its apogee, the highest point, reached 327 kilometers instead of the planned 230. This extra 100 kilometers turned the flight into a deadly trap. If the braking system had failed, Gagarin would have remained in orbit not for 10 days, as calculated, but for 20 or even 50. He would have simply died of asphyxiation when the air ran out. But then the spacecraft stabilized, and a moment of pure, almost childlike wonder arrived. Through the porthole, Gagarin saw what no human had seen before. What beauty! He transmitted to Earth. I see clouds, rivers, folds of the terrain. This wasn't a pilot's report. These were the words of a poet who was the first to see the planet from afar. A brief respite before the next act of the drama. And on Earth. Silence, tense faces in flight control. For several minutes, the longest of his life, chief designer Sergei Korolev lost contact with Gagarin. The spacecraft had exited the radio visibility zone earlier than it should have. They didn't know what had happened. They didn't know if he was alive. Korolev, known to all by the call sign Zarya 1, broke all radio silence protocols. He called repeatedly, "Keter, this is Zarya 1. Keter, this is Zarya 1. Only static answered. For the man who had staked everything on this flight, those minutes were torture. Contact was restored. But there was another secret built into the very design of the spacecraft. The controls were completely locked. Psychologists seriously feared that in zero gravity, a cosmonaut might lose his mind and try to manually steer the ship back to Earth. To gain control, Gagarin needed to open a special envelope and enter a 3-digit digital code. But right before launch, bypassing all instructions, Korolev whispered this code in his ear. 125. A simple number that was the ultimate expression of an engineer's trust in a pilot. And he needed that trust. The most dangerous phase of the flight was the descent. The braking propulsion unit fired, but the instrument module, which should have separated, remained attached to the descent module. Imagine riding a bicycle with a supermarket cart firmly tied to the back wheel. This entire assembly entered the atmosphere at 28,000 kilometers per hour, turning into an uncontrollable fireball. Gagarin saw streams of melting metal running in the porthole and heard a terrifying creaking of the bulkheads. He transmitted to Earth, "I'm burning. Goodbye, comrades." He was convinced it was the end. At an altitude of 100 kilometers, under monstrous G-forces, the burning cables connecting the compartments finally snapped. The capsule broke away. Gagarin was alive. But now, the last, most absurd danger awaited him. Not in space, but on his home planet. At an altitude of 7 kilometers, the ejection system activated. Gagarin was thrown from his superheated sphere. He and his capsule descended to Earth separately, on 2 different parachutes. And in this simple fact lay the central lie of Soviet cosmonautics. According to the rules of the International Aeronautical Federation, FAI, for a record of altitude and distance to be recognized, the pilot must land inside his aircraft. Descending by parachute made him a parachutist, not a cosmonaut. Therefore, The USSR lied for decades. At all press conferences, Gagarin was forced to repeat the memorized legend of a soft landing in the cabin. Falsified documents were submitted to the Federation. The world only learned the truth in 1991. But even this ejection nearly became his last moment. After exiting the capsule, the breathing valve in his sealed SK-1 spacesuit didn't open immediately. The system, which should have activated from a pressure sensor, malfunctioned. For dozens of agonizing seconds, already in his home atmosphere, he couldn't breathe. The man who survived space almost suffocated a few kilometers from home, an irony worthy of tragedy. When he could finally breathe, the Earth was already close, the scene of his landing, a plowed collective farm field in the Saratov region. In the middle of it, a giant orange figure. The first people he met were Anna Tokhtarova, the local forester's wife, and her 6-year-old granddaughter, Rita. They were digging potatoes and were paralyzed with terror at the sight of this strange being. His first words, spoken on Earth after returning from space, were strikingly simple. "I'm one of you, comrades, one of you." The meeting of the planet's most technologically advanced man with its simplest inhabitants. A better symbol for the flight of the son of the people could not have been imagined. However, the next arrivals were not collective farmers, but soldiers from a nearby air defense division. And here, irony turned into a deadly threat. The military didn't know that the first cosmonaut would land precisely there and then. They had received an order: find and guard an unknown object. To them, the man in the orange spacesuit was either a downed enemy pilot or a spy. A few more minutes of confusion, and they might have opened fire on him. To prove he was one of them, Gagarin removed his helmet. Beneath it was a face already being printed on posters, but the soldiers didn't yet know exactly whom they were looking for. The record was claimed by deception, his life saved by a miracle. Gagarin returned a hero. But immortality proved to be a prison for him, from which there was only one way out. His smile circled the globe. Kings and presidents considered it an honor to shake his hand. Crowds in London, Paris, and Havana carried him on their shoulders. He became the most famous and beloved person on the planet. But it was a gilded cage. He conquered space, but found himself trapped on Earth. He was turned into a living monument, to be worshipped but not allowed to take risks. A bird born to fly had its wings clipped. He, a combat pilot, was forbidden to take to the sky. For Gagarin, life without flying was a slow death. He began to fight, not for glory but for himself. He wrote letters to the Central Committee, demanded, persuaded. He didn't want to be a figurehead. He wanted to do his job. The culmination of this struggle was his appointment as a backup for Vladimir Komarov on the tragic Soyuz 1 flight. Gagarin yearned for space, even knowing that the spacecraft was completely untested. He was ready to stake everything again, just to escape the captivity of his own fame. Imagine achieving the main goal of your life at 27, the whole world at your feet. What next? Emptiness. Or would you, like Gagarin, begin to fight for the right to simply do what you love, even if it's mortally dangerous? Write in the comments what you would choose: glory or purpose. In the end, he got his wish. He was allowed to return to training. On March 27, 1968, he took to the sky in a MiG-15 fighter. It was a routine training flight in difficult weather conditions. It never ended. The man who survived a fiery re-entry, who endured a dozen failures in space, died a few kilometers from Earth. It wasn't space that took him, but the ordinary Earth sky he so desperately yearned for. And only after this. The circle closed. That same farewell letter, written 2 days before his spaceflight, was finally given to his wife, Valentina. It had waited 7 years for its moment. The sacrifice he had been prepared to make then had become a reality, but not at all as he had imagined. What can we learn from this story? Here is Gagarin's protocol for achieving the impossible. First, write the farewell letter. Accept the worst-case scenario. When you are ready for failure, fear leaves and you can act. Second, be the right face. Skills alone are not enough. The ability to inspire trust, to be one of them, is half the battle in any project. Psychologist Edward Thorndike called this the halo effect. An overall positive impression, like Gagarin's smile, makes us rate his specific qualities more favorably. This is not deception, but a law of social psychology. And third, fight for your skin. After achieving your goal, don't stop. True passion is not the outcome, but the process itself. So what must a person feel when taking a step into immortality? Perhaps the answer is that he isn't thinking about immortality. He is thinking about his work, about the risk, about his loved ones, and that is precisely what makes his act so great. In Gagarin's story, what is more important to you? His 108 minutes in space or that letter written on Earth? Write just one word in the comments, flight or letter.